No kidding, we're in a climate emergency. I expect you all know that. Emissions have been steadily going up. They're up again this year. The recent UN report said emissions must peak by 2025 to have any hope of staying below 1.5 degree warming, the 350 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. There are people who say it is already too late, and that would be a very bad thing. The science is very clear. We are at the highest level of CO2 ever in human history. The Earth has had higher levels of CO2. We were at 1,000 parts per million concentration of CO2, but there weren't any humans around. And best we know, there were palm trees and crocodiles in Greenland. It was not a very pleasant planet to try to reside on.
I think 5 years ago, the statement was we needed to peak by 2020, or we had no hope. You want to talk about
No, it was more like 2030 then that we peak. And they're bringing it down.
Okay.
The UN comes out. The UN comes out with all sorts of statements, and the dates are hard to keep track of. A couple years ago, they said we had 11 years to get to net zero. They've also said we have until 2050 to get to net zero, and net zero itself is a bit of a squirrely number. It's not that we, at net zero, it's not that we have no emissions, it's that you're offsetting whatever emissions you have, and depending on how well you believe in offsets, that may or may not make a difference. And then pick your favorite offset. A lot of people just say, well, we'll plant trees. At 1,000 parts per million, the Earth was carpeted in trees. It was a forest planet. So trees are probably not the answer. On the other hand, we do know what the answer is, and I'll get to that in a minute. Now, there's a lot of talk about you're the problem. If you just turn your thermostat down, if you just drive less, if you change your consumption habits, this will solve the problem. You're not the problem. 2/3 of CO2 has been emitted by 90 entities. Actually, this is a slightly outdated number. Rick Heady recently updated this number. 70% is from 100 entities. And you know most of these by name. They're the oil majors, the concrete majors, the cement majors, the steel companies, and the sovereign wealth funds, Saudi, Canada, Venezuela, the US, Russia, etc. So, yes, good housekeeping is a good thing to do, and you're not the problem. You may, however, be a big part of the solution. Regardless of who caused it, it's getting worse. This last year saw 1/3 of Pakistan go underwater. This time, 30 million people displaced. The last time Pakistan had these kinds of horrific storms, which was within the last 10 years, it was 20 million people displaced. 1,100 dead. These sorts of disasters are happening more and more frequently. And if you look at the incidence of billion-dollar storms, it's consistently going up. This, of course, is giving the insurance companies heartburn. And at this rate, the insurance companies will go out of business as well. It can get a great deal worse. The prospect of the Thwaites ice shelf in Antarctica collapsing and the Greenland ice dome, these would be catastrophic sea level rise, a meter or more. I was just in San Francisco flying into SFO and reflecting that SFO is not going to be around anymore. Neither will most of the coastal cities. Shanghai, Tokyo, London, a good chunk of New York, Tampa, New Orleans, trillions of dollars at risk. This is a very real prospect. Sea level rise is only one of the concerns, and indeed the collapse of the ice shelves is only one of the concerns. Guardian came out with a story not too long ago on the tipping points. We don't know where they are. We don't know whether we've already gone past them. But the researchers are now calling this an existential threat to humankind. Piece by, all your favorite scientists, Stefan Ramsdorff, Schellenhuber, Rockstrom, Johann Rockstrom, Owen Gaffney. What they're saying is there are 15 of these tipping points. The Arctic, the boreal forests, the Antarctic, the coral reefs, the Amazon, the meridial overturning circulatory, the flow of warm water from the Caribbean up past North Europe. That's what keeps North Europe habitable. And it's slowing. It is now measurably slowing. And it has stopped in recorded history in the 1000s, probably because an ice dam on the St. Lawrence broke and a whole lot of fresh water flooded into the North Atlantic. This tendency of the North Atlantic to sink, thus pulling the warm water up, stopped. It started again. We don't quite know why, but probably because the fresh water stopped flowing into it. It was a one-time event. And I suppose if Greenland melts all the way, it will again restart itself. The Earth is amazingly resilient. And in my darker moments, I think the Earth will be fine. It's humans who are in trouble. But you put all of these tipping points together, and no kidding, we're facing some pretty challenging times. This is the speed with which these things are coming at us, and they are coming reasonably rapidly. Christiana Figueres, who ran other than Kyoto, and this pin that I wear is the pin from Kyoto, ran the only successful one of the UN Conference of Parties, the Paris COP in 2015, said that we cannot continue to invest in fossils. Where capital goes over the next 15 years is going to determine whether or not we have a habitable future. We're not on track to meet Paris. And Paris was a retreat from the Kyoto Protocol, indeed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was negotiated at Rio, where the world agreed that climate change was a risk to humanity and it was incumbent on the countries of the world to act to prevent runaway climate change. At Copenhagen, because of the failure of Copenhagen, 2009, the nations of the world agreed that they would, rather than have a global agreement limiting emissions and limiting global warming, we would defer instead to the nations and have INDCs, individually determined national contributions. So every nation gets to say what their goal is and then measure their progress towards it. This was confirmed in Paris, and in theory, this is the regime we are all now under, and we're not making it. Even with backing away from a global agreement, we're still not making it. So fast forward to this last end of November, early December. Some of us trekked off to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for the 27th Conference of Parties. This tells you something about the state of play of the success of this whole regime, that we've been through 27 of these, 30 years worth since we agreed in Rio to have a global commitment to limit global warming. This is the graph of the rise in emissions and the rise in temperature plotted against the 27 COPs. The picture next to it has been variously dubbed Wadi al-Kaka and Showdown at Schitt's Creek. This was the blue zone, the UN's zone at Sharm el-Sheikh, when the sewers exploded into the UN meeting rooms. And I thought it was very emblematic.
Did it hit the fan?
It sure smelled. We achieved nothing. As at all COPs, they declared success because at the last minute there was an agreement to, at the next COP, have a discussion about loss and damages. Loss means the recognition by particularly the countries in the north that the countries in the south, who collectively are responsible for 4% of global emissions over time, are bearing most of the brunt of climate change. Damage means that the countries of the north agree to help pay for that. That latter is not going to happen. But it was considered a great success that the nations of the world agreed to talk about it at the next COP. Oh, Lord, make me chaste, but not quite yet. What we're looking at is a complete failure of the system. And this was really the first time that people began to talk about the operating system is broken. We're not dealing with a failure of one application. The whole operating system is broken. The whole concept of Conference of Parties will never achieve what it is that it was set out to do, because when you have a number of parties who are essentially oil wells with the right to issue passports, they aren't going to agree to anything significant. And so Saudi makes $1 billion a day for every day they delay action on climate change. You think they're going to agree? Anybody know where the next COP is? No, it's not. Dubai. Who's the president? Every year the host country names the president of the COP. Al-Jaber. What's his job? Head of the Emirates Oil Company. This is the Petro COP that is coming up. Now, I have colleagues who say, don't criticize. He actually is a good guy, I'm sure. And they say he is the power behind Masdar, which was this attempt by the Emirates to build a sustainable city in the desert, and that he is a big fan of renewable energy. So, by the way, says John Kerry. Charming. And for my sins, I will be in Dubai. And can I do this? Maybe. Maybe. I was sent a video, which is the question of the maybe. I may be able to find it and pull it up for you, of the show that will greet everyone when they arrive in Dubai. It's quite the light show. So this I found very piquant. We all come back from Sharm to be greeted by an assertion from the Secretary General of the United Nations that he's calling his own conference on climate. Now, the UN FCCC, Framework Convention on Climate Change, is a UN agency. So the SG is calling a competing conference, which is to say it's very clear to everybody that the COPs aren't working, will never work. The Secretary General is, to his credit, is becoming increasingly strident about how serious the problem is and the need to do something. I'm not quite sure what he thinks he's going to do by having a competing meeting. But now I guess we're all going to run off to New York in September and hear what the SG has to say. What we have to do is pretty obvious. The slope of the decline in emissions is pretty precipitous. And again, there have been reports after reports after reports out of the UN and everybody else who's paying attention to this that the time is now. We've got, we emit 36, now it's 36.6 gigatons of carbon every year. This is the study that said that gives us 11 years from the start of 2020 until we've emitted too much, so i.e. 2030. And it's a code red for humanity. I've always liked this cartoon by Sidney Harris, two old boys scribbling equations on the board, and the one in the middle it says, then a miracle occurs, and the one old boy says, I think you need to be a little more explicit in step 2. Happily, we know what to do. 2 things. Stop emissions by using renewable energy, and then remove the excess carbon that's in the atmosphere. And again, we know how to do this. There are a growing number of companies soaking up an astonishing amount of money, claiming that they can do this mechanically. We know how to do it using nature-based solutions, and do so profitably. And these 2 statements are what keep me going. The fact that we know how to do it, or rather we know what it is we have to do. The how we're going to get those 2 done is where it all gets interesting. A growing number of companies are setting what are called science-based targets, and there is a science-based targets initiative working with companies to help them set these targets. To set pledges that focus on rapid decarbonization and deep emissions cuts. I was with a colleague who was debating a Saudi minister who said, well, we take climate change very seriously. We will be net zero by 2060. To which he said, and we'll all be dead. We will be toast by 2060. So what matters in setting a science-based target is that it be near term. Within the next year or 2, certainly by 2025. The best targets are industry specific, and they state precisely how it is that you're going to go about cutting these emissions. What is increasingly interesting is that the best way we know to cut emissions, renewable energy, has now become a political football. Mr. Trump carried 20 of the 21 states with the largest per capita carbon emissions, losing only New Mexico. And yet, if you look at the districts in which renewable energy is now being commissioned, they're all red. This is called red washing. These governors are going on national television talking about how terrible renewable energy is, while this is a large part of what's driving their local economy. The 5 states with the biggest percentage of power from wind, Iowa, Kansas, South Dakota, Oklahoma, North Dakota, all voted for Trump. We're starting, though, to get some Republicans recognizing that the effect of climate change on them and their people is such that they really ought to do something about it. Republican mayor of Miami, yes, Miami is ground zero for a whole lot of hurricanes and is going to be underwater, business as usual. The really good news in the renewable energy field is that we are winning. Essentially, the only new power being commissioned is from renewables. And if you look at the retirement of plants, it's overwhelmingly coal plants and nuclear plants. And you will hear lots of talk about a nuclear renaissance. And unfortunately, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which to the best of my knowledge has nothing to do with reducing inflation, but has a hell of a lot to do with putting a great deal of money into renewables, also puts money into some stupid things. So you will hear talk about all the money that's going to flow into nuclear. The trouble is it's still incredibly expensive. And in this country, the only real experiment in trying to build new nukes down in Georgia is going very badly. So myself, I don't worry enormously about nuclear. There are some that are still around. Yes, it's probably a bad idea to make more nuclear waste that we still don't have an answer for what to do with. Yes, it is a nasty proposition, digging the uranium up from, in general, indigenous lands. And yes, it is a fit technology for angels and robots. Humans do rather badly trying to run nuclear plants. But basically, it's a dying industry. If you look at what the utilities are spending on, so US and Europe, it's renewables. Very little money actually going into nuclear, almost no money going into fossil, despite a great deal of publicity from the gas industry, the oil industry, about how they are an essential industry. Bloomberg New Energy and Finance says we spent $1.1 trillion last year into renewables, roughly the same amount as went into fossil, which is to say we've now drawn equal with fossil, which has always been the big investment repository for the economy. If you look at the stock market 10 years ago or so, essentially all of the leading stocks on the Dow Jones were fossil companies. Now there are none. Exxon fell off. The other big target for spending is electric vehicles. If you want to get rid of oil, it's transportation. And EVs the world around are coming on, particularly in China, and particularly in electric buses. And the amount of shift in China to electric buses is now visible in the world oil markets. Credit Suisse, about 2 months ago, came out with this report saying by 2025, solar will be at a cent per kilowatt hour. Ironically, they said, too cheap to meter. Obviously, many of you have heard that phrase before. When they said that, it was like,
It's a nuclear.
That's what nuclear was going to be until, as the economist said, it became too expensive to matter. Electric vehicles are pretty cool. In Texas, a couple of years ago, it got cold in the winter, which actually it does every now and again. The utilities were wholly unprepared, hadn't winterized anything, hadn't winterized their wind turbines or their gas or anything else. This old boy just plugged his Ford pick-em-up truck into his house. The Ford Lightning allows you to run your house for 7 days off your electric vehicle. This is genuine homeland security. We know how to run the entire world renewably. Study from University of California, Berkeley, Goldman School, that by 2035, the US could be 90% wind solar battery and save $1 trillion a year. Dr. Mark Jacobson at Stanford has been saying this for a long time. These are his recent numbers, how you can run the entire world renewably. So again, we know what it is that we need to do. And to the extent that you still feel personal responsibility for doing something about this, this is something you can do. Under the IRA, this would be a very good time to put solar on your house. This would be a very good time to install a heat pump. Yes, you will get paid. Very good time to pick up an electric vehicle. You will get rebates for all of these things. Here in Boulder, we've talked a lot about becoming 100% renewably powered. This would be a good time to get serious as a city about doing just that. There are now whole countries that are renewably powered. There are about 6 or 8 of them. It works just fine. You really don't need to have fossil backup. Now, to the extent that you want to talk about net zero, then it's interesting to talk about offsets. These are typically a financial instrument that companies invest in. They don't do anything themselves, but they buy, in theory, somebody else's reduction in emissions. And done well, I think this actually is part of the solution. I think the carbon markets are a very important part of the solution. A lot of people say we should have carbon taxes. Hands up those of you who like taxes.
I've just been working in Canada.
Slightly. Canada is still raising its emissions, as we are in Boulder with a carbon tax. What taxes reliably do is raise revenue. They don't necessarily cut your emissions, unless they are ruinously high, in which point you get to where the French did with the Gilets jaunes, where the people who are not yet in a position to make the transition revolt. And so I'm a much bigger fan of carbon markets as opposed to carbon taxes, particularly if you pick your offsets well. Nature-based solutions. We know how to take carbon out of the air, put it back in the soil where it belongs, and do so reliably and profitably. The best example of this, and the one thing that actually came out of our time in Egypt, although it actually happened before the COP, was the creation by an amazing group called SECOND. This is an organic biodynamic community an hour east of Cairo, run by this man, Helmi Abulesh, founded by his father, Ibrahim Abulesh, who 45 years ago picked the family up. They were at the time living in Austria. He was a doctor. Came to the Egyptian desert. And I can tell you that part of Egypt is barren, trash land, and built a paradise. And you drive for an hour out of Cairo through, well, nothing. And then you come down a little dirt road and you start to see trees, and then flowers, and then you enter Second. The first thing they did was plant trees and start a kindergarten, and then an elementary school, and then a high school, They now have a 4-year university in Cairo, Heliopolis University, with 3,000 students, 600-bed hospital, 6 separate industries taking the feedstocks from what they grow on the land with 2,000 farmers and turning them into products, which they then sell into Europe. Helmy said, what we're doing with all of our organic farming is putting carbon in the ground. Why don't we set up a deal with some European companies that are looking for offsets so that our farmers get paid to become climate heroes? So he was doing that with 2,000 farmers. We put him together with the World Food Program, which put him together with 43,000 farmers that they're working with in Egypt, and this program is now spreading. You can go on the SECEM website, SEKEM, and you can personally buy an offset that will help lift an Egyptian farmer out of poverty. So if I were doing offsets, that's where I'd go. And this was announced at a Future Economy Forum that we put on at Heliopolis University the day before we all decamped over to Sharm. And it was officially announced at Sharm as one of the contributions to COP, but it actually happened before. Now, what's going on with ground-based sequestration? This is a paper by a guy named Greg Retallick, who pointed out, as I said earlier, 60 million years ago, the Earth was at 1,000 parts per million concentration of CO2. When humans evolved, it was at 280 parts per million. Where'd the carbon go? And there have been all sorts of theories. Well, the Himalayan uplift, the volcanoes. I'm not entirely sure why that would decarbonize the planet, but these were the arguments. Retallick showed that what happened was about 30 million years ago, little grazing animals started nibbling at the edges of the forests, and grasslands started to spread across the planet. Grass has 40 times the carbon per weight compared to a tree. When you eat grass, when a grazing animal eats grass, the roots slough polysaccharides, sugars. That feeds the microbiological community in the soil, particularly the mycorrhizal fungi, which mineralizes the carbon. When the pioneers came across the Great Plains of the United States, they found 10 feet of thick black soil. It got there because of the coevolution of grazing animals and grasslands. Grazing animals dense packed because of predators. They eat everything in front of them, trample everything under them, fertilize everything behind them, move on and don't come back until the grass regrows. This action is what decarbonized the planet, and we can do it again. Projections by some colleagues of mine are that if we were to practice this kind of regenerative grazing on all the world's grasslands, not cutting any forests, leave the Amazon alone, just bioremediate the degraded rangeland and use the existing rangeland, convert the Midwest from growing corn and soy to feed to cows, which they were never designed to eat, makes them sick when they do, to grasslands and graze animals and put carbon in the soil. If we did this, over 60 to 100 years' time, we could get back to around 280 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, i.e. we roll climate change backward at a profit. Feel better? This is how it happens. Native prairie grasses have very, very deep roots. They take the carbon deep into the soil. This is Marty at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, holding what's called Kernza wheat. This is a wheat that they bred that is perennial. You don't ever have to plow the soil. Plowing soil decarbonizes, denitrifies the soil. You just create grasslands. The wheat above his head, with the little short roots, is annual wheat, where you have to plow every year. I work with a man named Dr. Martin Frick. He's seated with Carrie. who says, we know how to feed the world. He's director of the Global Office of the World Food Program. His day job is trying to keep alive 1/3 of a billion people who are now literally dying of starvation. He said, the way we feed the world, bring back the soils. Do this as part of a program of climate justice. He was the one who put Helmi together with the World Food Program's farmers in Egypt. Animal impact is essential. Understand that smallholder farmers the world around are the climate heroes. Women have to be key to this. Shift from this notion of cash crops for export to food sovereignty. Most of the people around the world who are hungry are smallholder farmers because they are not trying to grow food for themselves and their families, but rather for export. And then ensure that agriculture is done within planetary boundaries. Here's the other thing that's going on that I find particularly interesting. We are in a tectonic shift in finance. This man, Beavis Longstreth, who used to be a Securities and Exchange Commissioner, said it's entirely plausible, even predictable, that continuing to hold equities in fossil fuel companies will be ruled negligence. Why? Because until the Ukraine war, the fossil companies were not performing. And indeed, if you look at the history of oil prices, they go up, and then they come down, and then they go up, and then they come down. They will come down again. And if the spread of electric vehicles is what the analysts think that it will be, they'll probably stay down. Indeed, oil went negative for a short period in 2021. And again, until the Ukraine war, Exxon, if you were an investor in Exxon, you weren't gaining anything over the years. To the point that Goldman said, sell Exxon. And again, this is a turnaround from when the oil companies ruled the stock exchanges. Many of you probably know that a few years ago, a group of us rang the bell on Wall Street on behalf of a little company we created called Change Finance. We built the first truly fossil fuel-free exchange-traded fund. So for the price of a pizza, you can be an impact investor. Very, very high ESG, so it's not just that it's fossil-free. This is a basket of companies. It's basically the Fortune 500 without 400 assholes. 2019, a teenager led 8 million people into the streets. And a few months later, the CEO of Goldman Sachs said there's an urgent need to act. Also a powerful business and investing reason. The Bank for International Settlements warned of what they called green swan events, potentially extremely financially disruptive, driven by climate change. Shortly after, Larry Fink said climate is a defining factor. When millions of people took to the streets, he was watching. And then my friend Andy Behar wrote a letter in response to Fink's letter. Says, it was an eloquent statement articulating the existential issues confronting the entire economy and global society. What it lacks is an implementation plan. You're like a firefighter standing in front of a burning house with a fully charged fire hose in hand, describing the conflagration in exquisite detail, then asking all of us to go and find a bucket and form a bucket brigade. I wondered, how does a person who has spent his entire life amassing so much power fail to understand how to use it to solve the very problems you have identified? This is starting to change. carbon startups are prospering. Carbon startups raised nearly $20 billion last year. Fink said there are 1,000 more $1 billion so-called climate unicorns on the way. Why does Fink care? Do you think he has a green heart? Grunt. There is, pick your number, $40 to $70 trillion fixing to shift from, in general, old white men to their children, half of whom are women, all of whom are millennials or younger, and they don't want to invest in what their daddies were invested in. You may have heard that some of the Republicans essentially banned putting state pension money into BlackRock because Larry Fink is saying this sort of thing. And he lost $4 billion this way. He made $280 billion from the young people who are putting money into ESG stocks. He's doing very well, thank you. The banks are also facing this tectonic shift. There is now an alphabet soup of agencies. My least favorite is GFAN's Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was an effort by Mark Carney, who had been head of the Bank of England, to pull the banks together to agree to net zero. And he got an astonishing number, 450 financial firms with 130 trillion in assets to pledge to science-based targets. That's impressive. In Europe, there was a thing created called TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and then the Science-Based Targets Initiative. In 2021, a little outfit, a little nonprofit here in the United States called Sustainability Accounting Standards Board merged with a little nonprofit out of the UK called International Integrated Reporting Committee, IIRC, to create a thing called the Value Reporting Foundation. Now, why would you care? Because an amazing array of institutions, from the G7 to IFRS, which is the international agency that basically oversees reporting standards, the European Commission, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, all said this will become the standard on which companies' reporting will be judged. Listed companies, i.e. companies traded on the stock exchange, have to every year report on their finances. And for years they have ignored topics like climate, the environment. TCFD, SASB, IIRC now have created a thing called ISSP, Integrated Sustainability Standards Board, which is now run by the guy who had been the CEO at Danone, who had been trying to get Danone to become a regenerative company, a guy named Emmanuel Faber. I know Emmanuel, he is for real. The SEC in this country has started to say that it matters, if you are a listed company, what you say about climate. And there are standards now under consideration by the SEC. They were promulgated, about a year ago, March a year ago, and they've been debating them. And the debate is, do we require companies to report on all three scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is the carbon you emit because you've burnt something. Scope 2 is the carbon you emit because you've bought electricity from somebody who has burnt something. Scope 3 is everything else. So if you're Levi's and you make a pair of jeans and somebody takes it home and throws it away and it degrades and releases methane, Is that your responsibility as Levi's? That would be your scope 3. If you're Ford or Shell and you sell gasoline or a truck, and somebody drives that truck and releases carbon, is that your responsibility? That's scope 3. I can tell you for a fact, companies right now are freaked. Are we going to have to disclose scope 3? What are they? How do we count them? Help, somebody, get me somebody who can do carbon accounting. My students who are good at number crunching are being snapped up. SASB. I've said to students for a while, if you want a guaranteed career, become a SASB accountant. Every company, as soon as the SEC comes out with this ruling, it's going to transform accountancy. Everybody's going to be doing SASB compliant reporting. And I'm not going to bother with that. Net zero. A lot of companies now are signing on to commit to net zero. Until the SEC said, if you make a net zero commitment, you have to disclose it in your financial reporting. And if you have a net zero commitment, you have to disclose to scope 3. Companies are going, wait, we don't really want to have a net zero commitment. But their customers are demanding it. So we have this very interesting predator-prey relationship between the companies that are trying to do more or less honest marketing. Oh, and by the way, the FTC has now come out and said, are you greenwashing? Do you really mean what it is you say in your sustainability report when you talk about all your environmental and social initiatives? So you have companies like Microsoft saying, by 2030, not only will they be net zero, they will soak up all of the historic emissions that Microsoft has ever emitted using nature-based solutions and regenerative agriculture. And we're going to put $1 billion into doing it. And then Bezos jumps around and says, well, I'm going to put $10 billion in. We will see very shortly if he means what he's saying. But we've come a long way from when a 15-year-old girl sat out in front of the Swedish parliament with a handwritten sign saying, strike for climate. She says, adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. I don't want your hope. I want you to feel the fear that I feel, and then I want you to act. I want you to act as if the house were on fire, because it is. Clinton said it's the economy, stupid. He was right. And again, we know the two solutions. Renewable energy to eliminate emissions, and doing so is now more profitable than any fossil investment, even running existing fossil plants. And then regenerative agriculture, which is more profitable than industrial agriculture. So I hope this has been an enjoyable romp through what's the sort of cutting edge right now of the climate discussions and energy and a few other related subjects. I wake up every morning incredibly enthused to work on these solutions. And I hope after this you will too. Thanks so much.